Alright, so I just finished watching the Pistons versus Cavaliers game from last night, which was the first game where Bojan Bogdanovic finally returned from injury. Of course, as we've grown to see with the Pistons nowadays, they lost. They added to their losing streak and they're now at 17 losses in a row. I can't say I was too surprised by the loss to the Cavaliers, but they managed to keep it surprisingly close this time, and the Cavaliers didn't have any major absences or anything. So it was surprisingly a competitive game, which is not the same as a win, to be sure, but it's something, right? But anyway, it's no secret that the Pistons are in kind of a rough spot. They're really expected to take some sort of a jump or a leap this year, similar to what the Magic are doing this year, or the Thunder did last year, or the Grizzlies before them. But instead, the Pistons have been just a disappointment all around. And you can't even say it's because of tanking or anything. They just hired a new coach in Monty Williams, and all signs from the organization showed or told us that they were really trying this year. So they're just a bad team. Now, a lot of it is due to roster construction, of course. There's a lot of injuries on the team, a lot of really young players, so you can make that excuse. But I've seen an argument that's slowly increasing in popularity these days, that the Pistons' former number one pick and franchise player, Cade Cunningham, is actually part of the problem. Now, I always rejected this theory, mainly because I'm a big Cade fan, but the chatter has grown to some pretty remarkable levels. Basically, he's being seen, or he's being talked about as maybe not the best number one pick of all time, which I agree, he's no Victor Wembanyama or anything, but I'd say he's on the verge of being extremely underrated. I think he's suffering from the brunt of the front office's bad decision making in recent years. I don't think Cade is the problem, but the argument that people are saying is that Cade just isn't that good. He's not your number one option. So does that argument have any merit? Well, here's the thing. A common criticism of Cade's play is that he's very turnover prone and he has low efficiency as well, which on paper, yes, that is true. He's averaging 4.4 turnovers a game this year, and his field goal percentage is only around 41%. On top of that, even though he's averaging 22 points and 7.3 rebounds a game, he is kind of a volume scorer and he does take a lot of shots to get to those numbers. And on top of that, he remains a poor or a mediocre shooter as well. This season he's only shooting 35% from 3, which is still less than when he was shooting in college, but still a big improvement from last year. And to add on to all of that, he's not very good at drawing fouls and going to the free throw line either, with only 4.2 free throw attempts a game this year. So there's a lot of things going against Cade this season. And sure, you could look at it and say, this is just a sign that Cade isn't number one pick franchise player material. But I'm looking at it from another lens, more of this being a product of the situation he's in, rather than a long-term disappointment for him. And the reason I say that is because Cade's situation is also working against him. Among other things, you have the horrible spacing on the team with not many shooters, and the best shooters actually that they have available being injured. Among them, Bojan Bogdanovic, who until yesterday didn't even play this year. And they have other shooters like Joe Harris, for example, who hasn't even played himself. So he's missing that spacing that would open up the lanes for him to really get into the paint where he's able to do his damage. And on top of that, there's the fact that the players around him, similar to him, they're all pretty young and very inexperienced, even though some of them have huge potential, namely Jalen Duren, who's establishing a pretty strong chemistry with Cade this year, especially on the pick and roll. But yeah, Jalen Duren and Jaden Ivey and Asar Thompson, that's the foundation of a playoff team in a few years. The only issue is that they're very green. There's not much shooting between all of them. The hope is, of course, that the Pistons can fill that role by having the current roster, or some of the current players, naturally grow into strong shooters, and relying on some pickups like Bojan Bogdanovic, for example, or Joe Harris, to fill that space with some veteran experience. Now, so far that hasn't worked, but remember, there's a lot of injuries on this team this year. And that actually leads me to another point, that being some weird decisions that the front office has made, namely their insistence on trading for number 2 picks like James Wiseman and Marvin Bagley, who don't do a lot on the floor, especially with Jalen Duren growing into the strong center that I'm sure he'll end up being. But when you stack the roster full of bigs that can't really shoot, it doesn't really help Cade's case as a player. Now, at the beginning of the year, Coach Monty Williams insisted on playing Killian Hayes in the starting lineup, which, even though he has some defensive capabilities, he's pretty much a non-shooter, which further hurt the starting lineup spacing. But it also had the effect of bringing down Cade's raw numbers. And the reason I bring that up is because recently, as Cade started to find his rhythm this season, he's actually showing major signs of improvement, especially with Jalen Duren coming back from missing a big chunk of games in November. Now, Cade in the last 6 games has averaged 25.5 points with 7.5 assists and 4 rebounds a game on 44% field goal percentage and 44% from 3. And he's increased his free throw attempts per game to 5.5 and making 97% of those free throws. Now, this is just a sample of the last 6 games, and even though I did notice an improvement in Cade the recent few games, this actually came to my attention from a post by the host of the Locked On Pistons podcast over on Twitter. But anyway, those numbers are clear improvements, and I think that's closer to the improvement that we can expect from Cade this year. Now, I'm not saying there's an all-star potential this year, but there's going to be an improvement, that's for sure. Even last night, his performance was pretty refreshing. He had 23 points against the Cavaliers, with 8 rebounds and 11 assists. He even made half of his 6 3-point attempts, which I thought was pretty cool. So it was a great game for him, and it happened to be the first game with Bojan Bogdanovic, which goes back to my earlier point that this team kind of expects a lot from its veterans. They were signed for a reason, so having them on the court will no doubt help Cade in the long run. Now, that all being said, now there are issues that don't have anything to do with Cade's teammates or the injury situation. At the end of the day, all number 1 picks have to play with bad teams. That's just how it is. So it's not like Cade's the first player or the first number 1 pick to be put in this situation. But if you watch a Pistons game or two, especially during this huge loss streak that they have, you'll see that it's almost like the defense knows that Cade is the only real threat to them. They basically hound him on every possession, so he's not really playing as freely as he would like. And he did spend all of last year injured and not being able to basically develop for a full year, so I think he's kind of a year behind, but that's normal because he missed a year. And I realize there's an element of coping in my argument. Part of me just kind of hopes he'll just figure it out. But I don't know, man. I look at the recent Cavaliers game, for example. I see a team that could possibly become something, especially if Cade continues to improve to the franchise player I know that he's capable of being. And if I'm wrong, well, he might end up being a secondary option. Even in that case, it's not ideal, but I'd be fine with that. Like I said, Cade's one of my favorite young players, so any role that works for him, I'm all for it. Anyway, let me know what you think of Cade's progress this season and of the Pistons in general, and I'll see you soon.